Okay, it's Philip Lee returning with another episode of Civil War Chat. Today, October 20th, 2020, I want to talk about three things. One, the declaration of causes for secession that were issued by the first seven states, or most of the first seven states that seceded. The second would be the latest from Washington and Lee University in terms of changing or dropping the name of Lee from the school. And then third, I want to talk about Alexander Stevenson's Cornerstone Speech. So first, beginning with the declaration of causes, if you ever get into a discussion with people who have been educated by the academia about whether or not slavery was the reason for the war, they will simply cite, well, just look at the Declaration of Causes for the southern states. And what they really mean principally are the Declaration of Causes for Mississippi and South Carolina, in which both of those two list slavery as an important reason for seceding. And some of the other seven cotton states do as well. The big point that they're missing, however, is that they're equating the reasons with secession, even if you give them that was a reason for secession, even if you concede that. They are equating the reasons for secession with the reasons for the war, but they are not the same. The North, for example, could have permitted the first seven cotton states to leave peaceably. They could have evacuated Fort Sumter and let the first seven states leave peaceably. Actually, William Seward, who became Secretary of State under Lincoln, referred to the Confederacy of seven states as a composition of mosquito republics. He didn't think it could survive on its own. Others that were willing to at least acquiesce to letting them leave peacefully would include Edwin Stanton, who later became Secretary of War for Abraham Lincoln, and also Rutherford Hayes, who became president. There were a number of others as well. But the real reason the North did not want the South to secede is because it would have disrupted, there would have been economic consequences to the North because of disunion. The most important being the fact that you would have a low tariff nation on your southern border if you were in the United States. A low tariff nation would remove the southern market from the northern manufacturers, because the southern market could import goods directly from Great Britain. The industries in the North that had become essentially domestic monopolies, such as cotton textile making, iron products, and wool textile making, they would have lost their southern markets. There was always also the danger that you would have had you would have imports into the South, smuggled across the border into the North. So that was the principal reason that the North chose to resist disunion, because of the economic consequences that would result. There are a number of more that are covered in my latest book, the Civil War, the causes of the Civil War, including the loss of the monopoly trade. The intercoastal trade between the North and the South was monopolized by law by U.S. shipping companies, which were predominantly, again, almost totally in the North. But in the other point that you can make is that you can, whilst your debater may want to focus on the Declaration of Causes, you can point out to them that another way to make a comparison between the Confederacy and the United States is to look at the differences in their constitutions. Well, the first obvious difference that your opponent will point out is that the Confederate Constitution legitimized slavery. That's true, but it was also a states' rights document. For example, it prevented the central government from spending money on public works. It also prevented the central government from subsidizing private business. So those were held to be state responsibilities, if not states' rights. Sort of responsibilities and privileges, rights and privileges, sort of go together. So if you've got responsibilities, if you've got rights, you've also got responsibilities. And what the Confederate Constitution was saying is, if you want to, public work spending, that's the responsibility of the states. If you want private subsidy for private industries, that's also a responsibility of the state. Both of those items were, the central government in the United States was taking on responsibility for that, and the Southerners were against it. The Southerners also outlawed a protective tariff. Well, that was again something that was a difference between the two constitutions, even though it did not specifically relate to states' rights. But also a fourth point relating to the uh, prohibition on public work spending was that the president had a line item veto, which would discourage pork barrel spending by the Congress. So if they took, for example, a defense bill, an appropriations bill for the Confederate armies, and put some pork barrel projects in there, the president could veto those by line item, and thereby enable the appropriations bill for the armies to go through. Whereas in the United States, the whole bill would be hung up until the pork barrel, unless it was approved with the pork barrel projects. That too was an example of the Confederacy's resolution that the rights and privileges of the states were up to them. Then finally, the Supreme Court, the United States had a Supreme Court, whereas the statesmen and the parents and grandparents of the Confederate leaders realized since the beginning of the United States that the Supreme Court was a creature of the federal union and of the federal government, and as a result, its decisions tended to increasingly centralize power in the federal government. So they recognized the need for a Supreme Court, and they authorized it in their Constitution, but the Confederacy never formed one. And the principal reason was they did not know how to harness it in a way that would prevent it from steadily increasing the central power, or the powers into the central government. Bottom line, my point that I'm making here is that it's a states' rights document. So when one argues that the Civil War was over states' rights, or even secession, it was at least in part to over states' rights, because the Confederate Constitution showed that. If you look beyond the prohibition of slavery and look at the things that I've just outlined, the public work spending prohibition, the prohibition on subsidies for private businesses, and the line item veto. So I think, I've made the point that I want to make on that. When somebody throws the Declaration of Causes in your face in a debate to say that, the secession was all about slavery, and secession was, and tries to equate secession with the war, you can give your reasons why you don't think that applies, at least in my case, at least if you rely on what I'm saying. On the second point, Washington and Lee University, as I think many of you are aware, about 80% of the faculty at Washington and Lee University has decided that they want to have the name Lee removed from the school's name. Now, some of the alumni are fighting this, and they formed an organization called the Generals Redoubt, which so far has about $500,000 to spend in defending the Lee name. But it looks like that the administration at the school, along with the faculty, is bound and determined to take Lee's name out of there. The latest indication on that is they've announced a new speaker for a January speech, January 2021. And that'll be Alan Guelzo of Princeton University, who is, he's won, I think, 3 Lincoln Prizes because, yeah, he's a specialist on Lincoln, and I think he is in the process of writing a book on Lee. Nonetheless, he concludes that, in his personal opinion, Lee was a traitor. He does concede that there were arguments that would probably have prevented Lee from being convicted as a traitor, but he, in his personal opinion, Lee is a traitor. And generally, he's hostile toward the Confederacy. He's also, his most recent book is a thin book on Reconstruction. And one of his comments is that the South lost the Civil War, but it won the Reconstruction. And again, that's entirely focused on the racial aspects of it. In other words, what he's saying is the South had lost the war, but they regained, the white Southerners regained control of their states 12 years after the end of the war, and they were all bigoted racist, and they lynched blacks and terrorized blacks and held blacks underfoot for 100 years. And there's some truth. There's no denying lynching. There's no denying racial discrimination. There's no denying racism. But there was also racism in the North. Nonetheless, when he says the South won Reconstruction, I sent him a photo of some children. It was evident, it was taken around 1938, and it was children from the Depression, but they didn't, Southern farmers during the Depression they were worse off than in the 20s, but they weren't much worse off than where they were in, say, 1900 or 1910. And the photo shows, well, I'll just bring it up. Let me bring it up right now. Okay, as you can see, there's white children on our right and black children on our left. And as you can see, the clothes they wear are very similar. None of them have any shoes. Some of the white girls are holding watermelons. To the two black girls on our far left, or one of them is holding something that may be a watermelon or something like that. What the impression I get here is that they've just finished picking cotton for the day and they're about to go out and, you know, relaxed with some watermelon and some sort of a picnic type food. But nonetheless, my question to Alan Guelzo here is, this is 1938. Please show me the winners of Reconstruction in this photo. In fact, in truth, in 1940, as late as 1940, half of the sharecroppers were white and 2/3 of the tenant farmers were white. The sharecroppers earned an average of 15 to 25 cents a day. The longest lasting legacy of the Civil War was not legal segregation or Jim Crow. It was Southern poverty. In 1860, the per capita income in the Southern state, in the Confederate States, was was at the 72nd percentile of the United States average. After the war, it dropped to the 51st percentile, meaning that the average for the entire United States was twice the Southern average. So meaning that the North was even more than twice. But nonetheless, that's what happened after the Civil War. It stayed there for at least 35 years. But the final point is that it took 90 years for the Southern states to get back to the 72nd percentile, which is still below average, the still below average rate that they had, per capita rate that they had in 1860. In 1960, 100 years after the war had started, 8 of the 10 states with the lowest per capita income were former Confederate states. And since the Confederacy had only 11 states, that means only 3 of the 11 did not make the, well, you couldn't have 3 more in the top 10, but only 2 of the 11 escaped being in the bottom of the top 10. So the Guelzo he has a warped perspective on the Confederacy, on the South, and on Robert E. Lee. Washington and Lee has invited him to be one of their prominent speakers in January. It's a continuation of the same thing. We're just going to have to hope and do our best to see to it that the Lee name sticks at Washington and Lee, because that school could not have survived without Robert E. Lee. The donations that came into the school after he took over is what kept it going, and the tradition that he established. And one of the key traditions that he started, one of the key traditions that he made prominent was the honor code. And Roger Mudd, who used to be what do you call it, a news figurehead for CBS, kind of like Walter Cronkite, he went to Washington and Lee, and he said that during that honor code, with that honor code, the teachers, the professors could actually leave the classroom knowing that the students wouldn't teach, as long as they signed the honor code pledge at the end of the blue book and wrote it at the end of the blue book and signed their name. I've talked to other W&L graduates and say that applied even when they were going. So it's something that supposedly existed before Lee got there, but Lee made it what it had become. It was then, of course, known as Washington College, not Washington and Lee. And famously, Lee said, when he was addressing the students, "We have only one rule here at Washington College, and that is that all students must be gentlemen." And that has lasted until now. Hopefully, if they take the Lee name out of there, that's not going to last, and neither, in my opinion, will the honor code. Now, the third point I wanted to talk about is the Cornerstone Speech. Alexander Stephens of Georgia became vice president of the Confederacy. He made a speech in 1861 in Savannah in which he referred to the blacks as the cornerstone of the Confederacy, or the slavery as the cornerstone of the Confederacy, by describing or portraying the blacks as inferior race, not capable of taking care of themselves, a race needing direction, need to be told what to do, and best off in slavery. That is too is often pointed to as the raison d'etre of the Confederacy, the essence of the Confederacy, and it's used as an excuse to tear down the Confederate monuments. That was in 1861. 5 years later, the Confederacy has been defeated under presidential Reconstruction before the Republicans took over with congressional Reconstruction, which came in 1868, and 1865, and 1866. The Reconstruction governments that were in place then were those authorized by President Johnson. And they, in Georgia and others, included a number of ex-Confederates in the legislature and also elected to Congress, although the Republican Congress would not seat them. Nonetheless, the Georgia legislature was composed entirely of white Southerners, many of them ex-Confederates. And in February 1866, about 10 months after the war had ended, Alexander Stephens addressed the Georgia legislature about a lot of things, but among the things he talked about was the treatment of ex-slaves. And that's what I'm going to refer to them here as. I'm just going to quote from an excerpt from his talk concerning the blacks, the ex-slaves, the freedmen. Quote, "Wise and humane provisions should be made for the ex-slaves so that they may stand equal before the law, in possession and enjoyment of all rights of persons, liberty and property. Many considerations claim this at your hands. Among these may be stated their fidelity in times past. They cultivated your fields, ministered to your personal wants and comforts, nursed and reared your children, and even in the hour of danger and peril, they were, in the main, true to you and yours. To them we owe a debt of gratitude as well as kindness. I speak for them as we know them to be, having no longer the protection of a master or a legal guardian. They now need all of the protection that the shield of law can give them. But above all, this protection should be secured because it is right and just." Considering that that was in 1866 by a Confederate vice president, I can show you many talks from politicians in the North at that time that were far more racist than that. That is almost completely enlightened for the era, and especially when it comes from Alexander Stephens. It needs to be kept in mind that while you can Google Alexander Stephens' speech and you will get pages and pages of references to the Cornerstone Speech, but you won't find many. In fact, it's hard to find the address that he made to the Georgia legislature in February 1866. You Google it, use those phrases, and you should be able to find it. I want to return also to the original point about the Declaration of Causes in Secession, or actually also this includes the Washington Lee observation. Guelzo is very definitive in his conclusion that there was no right to secession, that it was illegal, and it couldn't be done by anyone. I'm not going to argue that point. I can argue it. In 1860, it was really unsettled, and that was one reason the South felt that they were entitled to it, and a reason it was unsettled, and this is what Guelzo doesn't mention in his talk that I saw on YouTube that he made to Washington and Lee a few years ago. What he doesn't mention is at least 5 times between 1789, when the Republic of the United States was formed, and 1850, which is approximately 60 years, at least 5 times the New England or the Northeastern states talked of secession or threatened secession. So if he is going to say that, the South's secession was illegal, I would really be interested to know what he would say about the times when prominent New England politicians, including John Quincy Adams, who was president earlier and then went into Congress and said that over the annexation of Texas, that it justified disunion, meaning secession. So if you want to get the facts on that, my latest book is Causes of the Civil War, and it describes, among other things, the 5 times the northern states tried to secede, and it also describes another thing that is often overlooked is the joint resolutions from 10 free states north of the Ohio River and Mason-Dixon line during December of 1860 and January of 1861. While the first 7 Confederate states were seceding, 10 northern states legislatures prepared joint legislative resolutions on their reasons for opposing secession. Not one of them said that they wanted to abolish slavery in the southern states. In fact, the most common theme was that they wanted to preserve the Union. And what is important is to examine why they wanted to preserve the Union. This book also gives a lot of information that document the case that they wanted to preserve the Union in order to avoid the economic consequences to them of disunion. So that's Causes of the Civil War. You can get that at Amazon for $22. If you would like to get a signed copy, you may simply email me, Phil_Leigh, Leigh, at me.com. Phil, PHIL_Leigh at me.com. Okay, that's our show. Thanks for watching.